Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the research you've collected and turn it into actionable knowledge.
Today, we're embarking on a journey into the heart of early 20th century art, a journey that forces us to question who gets to be called an artist and where true expertise is actually forged.
Yeah, this story we're unpacking today, it really did fundamentally rewire the museum world's view on talent. And it begins not in some elegant studio in Paris or New York, but in the grimy, dangerous shale mines of Scotland.
And the back-breaking industrial rail yards of Pittsburgh. It's about as far from the art world as you can possibly get.
The man at the center of it is John Kane, born in 1860, a painter, renowned for his powerful, naive art.
But just calling him a painter, it almost feels like it misses the point. It misses the tension of his entire existence.
Right. He was a coal miner, a Gandhi dancer, we'll get to what that means, an itinerant house painter, and a self-taught immigrant. This was a man whose hands were, they were scarred by decades of physical labor long before they ever held a fine art brush.
And that tension is absolutely the core of his historical significance. You have to understand the context of the time, the 1920s.
Okay, so paint that picture for us. What was the official art world like then?
It was consumed by modernism. Yeah. Think abstraction, conceptual theory, academic pedigree. It was all about who you studied with, which ism is you belong to.
So very clubby, very insular.
Extremely. And into this world walks John Kane. His arrival was, and this is not an exaggeration, an institutional earthquake. He was the very first self-taught American painter in the 20th century to be recognized and collected by a major established museum.
The first one. That is truly a demarcation line in art history. It suggests the art establishment was forced, maybe kicking and screaming, to look outside its own ivory towers.
Precisely. When his work was accepted into the prestigious Carnegie International Exhibition, an event that was, reserved for global artistic elites and established modernists, it did more than just shock the critics.
It must have caused an uproar.
A huge one. It created a new category of artistic legitimacy. He inadvertently proved that talent, vision, and lived experience could supersede formal training. This single acceptance paved the way for the entire concept of outsider art, and allowed later self-taught masters like Grandma Moses to be taken seriously.
So before Kane, you needed the pedigree.
You needed the pedigree. After Kane, the authenticity of your vision became a valid and, in some cases, a more valuable form of expertise.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is to trace the trajectory of this extraordinary life. We're diving deep into the historical records detailing his journey from the soot and danger of industrial labor to eventual hard-won artistic immortality.
We're looking for this story behind the canvas.
Especially since his success, and this is almost unbelievable, was initially suspected by major media outlets to be a complete and total hoax.
A prank. They thought he was a prank.
Yeah.
So we have to begin by establishing the hard-scrabble foundations of his life. We can't understand the authenticity of his art without first understanding the raw physicality of his origin.
Let's start at the beginning then. West Calder, Scotland, 1860. The man we know as John Kane was born John Kane on August 19th. His parents were Irish, living in Scotland.
Which immediately situates him. That places him right in the heart of the industrial working class of mid-19th century Britain, a world just defined by relentless labor and a very precarious existence.
And that precariousness hit his family hard and early.
Brutally. When Kane was just 10 years old, his father died. That left his mother, Biddy, to raise 7 children completely on her own.
And the source material gives us a detail about his father's work that is just intensely grim. It really shines a light on their economic reality.
He was a gravedigger in West Calder.
A gravedigger. The job itself and the labor is just so hauntingly cyclical. There was a local saying about his father's work.
Yeah, it encapsulates the quick, brutal cycle of life and death in that era. He dug a grave on Friday and filled it on Monday.
Wow.
It's a stark, almost fatalistic image. It illustrates how immediate and constant the presence of death and demanding physical labor was in young John's world.
And the consequence of his father's passing was immediate and absolute for John himself.
Of course. Formal education was a luxury they could no longer afford. He was forced to quit school, sacrificing his youth, really, to enter the workforce and support his family.
His first job was in the shale mines, specifically at a place called Young's Paraffin Works.
And we really need to be clear about what this means. We're not talking about light manufacturing here.
No.
We're talking about dangerous subterranean industrial labor for a 10-year-old boy.
What exactly was shale mining? What was he doing down there?
Well, shale mining was a foundation of the Scottish industrial economy at the time. It was incredibly harsh, environmentally destructive. He would have been exposed to darkness, constant damp, and noxious fumes. They were extracting crude oil from a rock called oil shale.
So he knew what the inside of the Earth looked like, not from a geology textbook, but from chipping it away with a pickaxe.
Exactly. That early, visceral understanding of mineral extraction, of what lies beneath the surface, you have to believe that shaped how he later viewed and painted a landscape.
And even in that environment, amidst all the grime and the danger of the Young's paraffin works, we see the first recorded flicker of that creative impulse.
It's a fascinating anecdote.
A moment that shows his inclination towards shaping material, even at great personal risk.
He was clearly struck by the malleability of the hot paraffin wax they were processing. It was a byproduct of his labor. And he gets this idea. He decides he wants to make a mask of his own face for his mother, Biddy, a tangible representation of himself.
Which is such a beautiful, creative gesture, but also incredibly dangerous given the material.
He ended up burning his face in the process. Thankfully, not seriously, but the impulse is what's key here. It shows a fundamental, innate urge to transform the crude material of his labor environment into something personal, something expressive.
Long before he ever considered a paintbrush.
Decades before. It proves that the desire to create wasn't some intellectual choice he made later in life. It was a deep-seated part of his personality that just had to be suppressed by economic necessity for decades.
But that creative impulse, it seems it could never truly be extinguished.
No, but it was immediately overshadowed by the family's continued search for economic stability. After his mother remarried, John followed the path of millions of European laborers in the late 19th century.
Migration.
At age 19, he emigrated to the United States. This was in 1879.
And he was following family.
Yes, his stepfather and his older brother Patrick, who had settled in Braddock, Pennsylvania, right near Pittsburgh. And this marks his entry into the massive, relentless, and often brutal industrial engine of the American steel belt.
Once in the U.S., his life just became a dizzying rotation through the hardest, most physically demanding jobs available. He was essentially a human machine fueling the Industrial Revolution.
His first documented job in America was with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. And that's where he took on the role of a Gandhi dancer.
Okay, this job title sounds almost romantic, but the reality was anything but. For those who are unfamiliar with the term Gandhi dancer, let's spend a moment on this. What did that work actually entail?
A Gandhi dancer was a track laborer. Their primary function was track maintenance manual, repetitive coordinated labor performed in big groups.
And the name Gandhi dancer comes from where?
It's believed to have come from the Gandhi Manufacturing Company of Chicago, which produced the long-handled tools like tamping bars and shovels that they used. Their main task was tamping down, or stamping the stones, the ballast between the railroad ties.
On the dancer part.
That came from the rhythmic nature of the work. They had to work in unison, often led by a caller who would be singing or chanting to keep the rhythm. It looked like a sort of coordinated dance.
So imagine you're bending, lifting a heavy iron tamping bar and slamming it down thousands of times a day, every single day, under the hot sun, just to make sure the tracks remain stable.
It was backbreaking, intensely manual work that required immense coordination and strength. It defined a life lived constantly near the danger of the rails.
But the instability of industrial employment meant he couldn't settle. This early period of his life is just characterized by ceaseless mobility, always chasing a paycheck in the most dangerous, heavy industries.
Absolutely. After the B&O Railroad, he moved into the steel industry, working a stint at the National Tube Company in McKeesport. But then he moves to Connellsville, Pennsylvania, to work at the infamous coke ovens owned by Henry Clay Frick.
And that name, Henry Clay Frick, that's a crucial detail. His operations were notorious.
They were. The coke ovens were basically the blast furnaces of the era, operating under utterly horrific conditions.
Can you describe that environment for us? What would he have experienced?
It was hellish. Coke is the fuel source for making steel, and the process of converting coal into coke involved baking it in these huge beehive-shaped ovens. So you have constant searing heat, thick black smoke, and toxic air just filled with sulfur and coal dust.
And Frick's workers.
They often lived in miserable company housing, enduring relentless shifts and pervasive health risks. For Kane, this wasn't just a job. It was an environment that stripped him bare, constantly pushing the limits of his physical endurance.
And as the mid-1880s approached, the search for work led him even further afield. It really emphasizes that industrial labor was less a fixed career and more of a nomadic existence.
He was chasing the seams of coal. He migrated south, mining in Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky. This mobility just underscores the sheer desperation and effort required just to survive. Moving across state lines, often alone, simply to find another underground contract.
Yet, despite this constant movement, the sources emphasize why he kept gravitating back towards western Pennsylvania.
He returned to the Pittsburgh region repeatedly, securing other mining jobs because he wanted to be near his family. This detail is so essential. It illustrates the fundamental human need for community and kinship pulling him back, despite the inherent danger and the grueling nature of the labor that the region demanded of him.
So his life was a constant struggle, a pendulum swinging between the raw necessity of labor and the desire for proximity and connection.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And that constant physical movement, that pendulum of necessity, was violently stopped in 1891. We now transition to the physical and emotional turning points that irrevocably altered John Kane's life and forced his trajectory toward art.
The defining tragedy of his early adulthood occurred when he was just 31. He was struck down while walking along the B&O railroad tracks.
The very place where he had spent years laboring as a Gandhi dancer.
The irony is just brutal.
The specific details of this accident are horrifying, and they speak volumes about the prevailing attitude toward worker safety at the time.
They really do. The engine that struck him was running without its lights.
Without its lights.
That detail is critical. It implies gross negligence in the dangerous, dark environment of nighttime rail work. It wasn't just an unfortunate misstep. It was an industrial failure that cost him dearly.
And the consequence was severe.
The engine severed his left leg 5 inches below the knee.
And that disability fundamentally changed his life. He was fitted with an artificial limb. His days of deep mining and intense Gandhi dancing were over.
The trauma must have been immense, but it resulted in a strange kind of stability. The B&O, perhaps in a minor attempt at recompense, gave him a new job.
What could he do?
He became a watchman for the railroad. It was a position he held for 8 years.
So for the first time in his adult life, he had a stable, predictable routine. One that removed him from the immediate, crushing physical demands of the most dangerous industries.
And that stability, though it was born from a terrible tragedy, provided a necessary bridge.
A bridge to what, exactly?
To a different kind of work. This transition, from a life of violent motion to one of required stillness, subtly nudged him toward work that utilized different skills. This brings us to the true dawn of his artistic pursuit.
Right. After his watchman role, he took a job that involved applying color rather than just mining it from the earth.
Exactly. He went to work at the Press Steel Car Company in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, painting newly constructed steel railroad cars.
This is where the physical environment of his labor intersects directly with that suppressed artistic impulse we talked about.
It's a perfect intersection. He wasn't hired to create murals or anything artistic. He was applying the standard, solid, utilitarian colors, the greens, the blacks, the browns, to massive steel components.
But the switch in medium, from handling coal dust and shale to handling paint pigment, that must have felt like a profound shift.
It absolutely sparked something in him. The sources detail how, during his lunch hour, he would use the enormous, newly painted steel cars as his temporary canvas.
So he wouldn't just sit and eat.
No, he would begin to draw landscapes on the sides of the cars, purely, as he put it, to fill in the colors for himself. He was performing this private, illicit act of creation on company time.
That image is so powerful and so poignant. A self-taught, one-legged immigrant standing beside a monumental steel rail car during his brief unpaid lunch break, creating transient art.
And they were just glimpses of his inner world, often landscapes, perhaps even attempts at capturing the light on the industrial structures all around him. But what makes the anecdote so telling is their temporary nature.
They didn't last.
Not at all. As soon as his lunch break was over, he would have to return to his official duties, and the standard, solid color of the railroad car paint would inevitably cover up his sketches. His creative effort was literally being erased daily by the utility and uniformity of industrial production.
That must have been incredibly frustrating. I mean, this constant artistic burial, it just illustrates the real struggle he faced to dedicate serious time or material resources to painting. He didn't have the luxury of a dedicated studio or expensive canvases.
And that lack of luxury led him to try and monetize his developing visual skills in a way that bridged the gap between necessity and art.
How did he do that?
For a short time, he attempted to earn some extra money by enlarging and tinting photographs for working-class families in his area.
So this is a precursor to the later controversy, right? He was using existing photographic imagery as a base.
Yes, and that context is everything. He wasn't doing it to trick anyone. He was providing a service. In that era, working-class families couldn't afford a painted portrait by a professional artist. It was out of reach.
So Kane offered an alternative.
An accessible, affordable way to elevate a simple photograph into something that resembled fine art by enlarging it, mounting it, and then hand-tinting it with oil paint. It was an entrepreneurial endeavor driven purely by economic need.
But before that professional scrutiny came, a devastating emotional blow sent him spiraling back into the instability of his youth.
He had found love and stability. He married a woman named Maggie Halloran in 1897.
But their stability was tragically short-lived.
In 1904, the death of their infant son just derailed his entire world. The sources describe the profound depth of his despair, plunging him into what they call a vortex of drinking and depression.
So the man who had survived a severe industrial accident and endless hard labor was completely undone by personal loss.
It seems so. He essentially abandoned the hard-won stability of the watchman and carpenter jobs and returned to being an itinerant worker, a wandering house painter and carpenter.
It's a tragic reversal. His stability shattered, he returned to movement, seeking escape, or maybe just oblivion in work.
But what's fascinating here is that even in this period of emotional wreckage and wandering, his true pictorial work finally began to emerge. The chaos seemed to free him to create in a new way.
So in 1910, while he was working in Akron, Ohio, he started doing actual pictorial oil paintings, and his canvas, it wasn't purchased linen.
No, his canvas was the only material available to him. Discarded boards and wooden scraps salvaged from construction sites.
He was literally finding value in industrial waste.
It reflects his lifelong perspective as a laborer. He used paint intended for houses and signs and surfaces that were destined for the dump, forcing his emerging artistic vision to conform to the constraints of necessity.
By the time World War I ended, he was back in Pittsburgh, but still separated from Maggie and their children, estranged by the grief and the years of wandering.
He spent the remainder of his life in Pittsburgh, constantly working, quietly developing this unique skill set that the formal art establishment was about to discover.
So the decades of hard work, the resilience in the face of loss, and the quiet dedication to painting on found wood, it all culminated in his 60s.
Yes, and this is where we see persistence truly paying off, but not without immense resistance from the establishment.
Kane spent his mid-60s repeatedly challenging that establishment. The Carnegie International Exhibition, sponsored by the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, it was perhaps the most elite venue in the country for modern art.
It was the place to be. And Kane, the house painter, submitted his work in 1925 and again in 1926.
And both were rejected.
Flatly rejected.
Yeah.
The audacity of a self-taught, working-class painter entering a competition that was dominated by academics and European modernists, it just cannot be overstated.
His style would have been so out of place.
Completely. Direct, representational, almost crystalline in its clarity. It would have been the complete antithesis to the abstract, theoretical work prized by the juries of that era.
But he didn't quit. In 1927, on his third attempt at the age of 67, he finally found the crack in the wall.
He did. And as so often happens in art history, it took one champion to convince the rest. In 1927, that champion was the American modernist painter Andrew Dasburg, who was serving on the jury.
And Dasburg saw something.
He saw something authentic and powerful in Kane's work that the other jurors, who were blinded by academic prejudice, they initially missed it.
What was Dasburg's argument? How did he manage to persuade an elite jury to accept the work of a man who was still actively employed as a house painter?
The sources suggest Dasburg was actively looking for work that rejected the sterility of academic tradition. He was tired of it. He argued that Kane's lack of formal training was actually a strength. He said his vision was utterly pure, untainted by the rules of perspective, composition, and theory that govern the academies. Dasburg essentially argued that Kane's art was a raw, honest window into the American experience, which was exactly what the modern art world needed to confront.
That is the validation of naive art in a nutshell. The idea that a lack of formal training can translate to an unparalleled sincerity.
And the piece that got in was seen in the Scottish Highlands, which is now held by the Carnegie Museum.
Its acceptance wasn't just an artistic breakthrough, it triggered a media explosion.
Oh, absolutely. The story of the untrained 67-year-old painter who had spent his life mining coal and laying railroad track getting into the International. That was a headline generator. It was trumpeted by the newspapers across the country.
But that media attention came with a profound caveat. The public and much of the press simply couldn't believe it was real.
The reaction was intense skepticism. People suspected it was an elaborate prank orchestrated by the museum, or maybe a clever hoax by the artist himself. It was just deemed impossible that a man of his background could produce art worthy of such a prestigious venue without some form of sophisticated deception.
This suspicion immediately highlights the deeply entrenched class bias of the era. The working-class laborer, no matter how talented, was just not expected to be a genius.
Exactly. The acceptance of his work challenged the entire hierarchy, and the immediate reaction was to find a reason to delegitimize it.
But amidst this chaos, the massive public profile yielded an astonishing, intensely personal reward that completely transcends the art world.
This is the emotional climax of his life story. It's
Yeah.
just incredible. Remember, Kane had been separated from his wife Maggie for over 10 years. They were entirely out of contact due to that spiral of grief and wandering that followed their infant son's death.
Right.
The news of his sensational artistic success, the newspaper reports, the photographs, it reached Maggie in West Virginia.
So the very act of artistic expression, born out of the pain that had initially caused their separation, is what brought them back together.
It did. She saw his name and his image in the paper, and the reconciliation followed. They remained together for the remaining years of his life.
Wow. That personal triumph, the redemption of his family life through his art, that is perhaps the most beautiful vindication of his work.
I think so, too.
Yet, the celebration of his success and reconciliation was immediately interrupted by the most intense professional scrutiny. This became known as the sham controversy.
The jealous, unsuccessful artists and the skeptical establishment, they were not finished with him. They were determined to find evidence that invalidated his genius.
And they focused on his past.
They focused on his earlier attempts to monetize his photographic tinting skills. It was revealed that Kane had sometimes painted his portraits and certain figure compositions over discarded or existing photographic images.
This detail was immediately weaponized. They called him a cheat. But if we look closely at the sources, why did he do this? Was it some conscious, avant-garde artistic choice?
No. The records are very clear on this.
Right.
This was done purely for financial reasons. And this is the crucial distinction we have to emphasize.
Go on.
An established modernist like Picasso could use collage and found objects as a theoretical statement about the nature of art. When John Kane used a cheap photograph as a guideline or a base, it was a necessity driven by the cost of materials and the desire to produce affordable art for his neighbors.
It seems profoundly hypocritical. The self-proclaimed avant-garde critics who championed appropriation in unconventional mediums suddenly drew this hard line when the artist was a working-class man finding a cost-saving shortcut.
It absolutely speaks to the class bias prevalent in art critique at the time. They couldn't stomach the idea of innate, untrained genius emerging from a coal mine, so they seized on any technical anomaly to delegitimize him.
What was their specific argument against him?
They argued that because he used a mechanical aid, a photograph, his work couldn't be truly primitive or truly naive. They essentially tried to strip him of his credibility based on his lack of resources. He was a catch-22.
The rhetoric was brutal. Newspapers hounded him, claiming he was a sham, suggesting his entire career was built on deceit. What was his response to this professional attack?
His response was the most powerful act of defiance and dedication possible. He just kept painting.
He ignored them.
He ignored the critics and continued to produce his authentic, primitive landscapes, and most importantly, his incredible self-portraits.
And that resilience is perfectly captured in his famous 1929 self-portrait, which is now a centerpiece of the Museum of Modern Art's collection.
Think about the timing of that piece. He painted that in the immediate aftermath of the worst attacks on his character and his integrity.
What does it look like?
It's an intensely rugged, honest self-depiction. He paints himself half naked from the waist up, in his working clothes, without any romanticism, directly confronting the viewer. His gaze is unflinching. By immortalizing his own rugged likeness, he validated his self-taught status and his lived experience more effectively than any defense written by a critic.
It was his ultimate statement of self-affirmation, a rejection of the critics' attempts to define him.
It was. The self-portrait became the final, definitive answer to the sham controversy.
So despite the initial violent skepticism in the controversy, John Kane's professional recognition just continued its upward trajectory. It cemented his legitimate place in the art world.
By 1931, he had secured his first New York one-man show.
And that's significant. New York was the ultimate arbiter of American taste. And the fact that Kane was embraced by this sophisticated scene, It confirms that the weight of his authenticity eventually crushed the prejudice.
It did. His legacy today focuses intensely on his signature subject matter, his landscape paintings of industrial Pittsburgh.
And these aren't just pretty pictures of hillsides. They are deeply personal documents of the terrain that defined his entire existence.
They are topographical records filtered through an intensely subjective, working-class lens. Kane's Pittsburgh is the place he knew intimately. The grime, the smoke plumes, the sprawling steel mills, the bridges, and the rail yards.
He viewed these scenes from the vantage points of the hillsides he had walked as an itinerant house painter, or watched from his position as a watchman.
Exactly. He wasn't romanticizing industry, as some wealthy patrons might have. He was documenting a landscape that had demanded every ounce of his physical strength. His canvases capture the monumental scale of these industrial structures, the smoke, the labor, the sheer presence of the American industrial machine, with an honest, unique clarity.
Unfortunately, before he passed away, the details of his incredible journey were preserved in his own voice.
He collaborated with a woman named Marie McSwiggan, a respected Pittsburgh author and newspaper reporter, to document his life story.
The output of that collaboration, which was recorded during the last 2 years of his life, was Skyhooks, the autobiography of John Kane.
And that book is so important. McSwiggan ensured his story wasn't solely told through the filtered and often condescending language of art critics, by the man himself.
So Skyhooks captures his direct, candid voice.
Yes, detailing his early life in Scotland, the accident, his poverty, and his relentless drive to create. This autobiography is an incredibly important piece of historical documentation. It grounds his artistic success in the reality of industrial labor.
John Kane died of tuberculosis on August 10th, 1934. He was 73, so it was relatively soon after he achieved that widespread recognition. He's interred at Pittsburgh's Roman Catholic Calvary Cemetery.
But the ultimate vindication of his life's work is the institutional presence of his paintings today. The fact that the same art world that initially dismissed him now actively collects, displays, and preserves his work is the final proof of his profound impact.
And we should be clear, this isn't a footnote artist. This is an artist whose work sits alongside the giants of modern art.
Absolutely. We're talking about the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian Institution.
And you have to mention the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh.
Of course, the institution that first opened the door. And there were even international collections, like the Zander collection in Cologne, that hold his work. This roster proves he forced the art world to radically expand its definition of what constitutes legitimate artistic talent.
His work showed that authenticity of vision, derived from the hardest, most physical American experience, could not be ignored.
He took the expertise he gained as a miner, a rail laborer, and a painter of houses, and used it to paint the world he knew, a world of grime, of structure, and of immense physical effort.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what does this all mean?
John Kane's life provides an extraordinary pivot point in cultural history. His journey from Gandy dancer and shale miner to a foundational master of American art is a testament to persistence and self-taught talent.
His life fundamentally challenged the hierarchy of the art world. By establishing himself as a legitimate master, Kane proved that the deepest knowledge and expertise can be found not in the lecture hall or the academic studio, but in the grime and heat of real-world manual labor.
His success legitimized the idea that life itself could serve as the most rigorous form of artistic education.
And you have to remember the controversy. The critics used his reliance on photographic bases, born purely from financial necessity, to try and discredit him.
Right. They chose to see his technique as deceit rather than as adaptation driven by poverty. His triumph confirms that unique perspective and honesty of vision are ultimately more powerful than academic rules or class prejudice.
That enduring tension, the conflict between the value we place on formal education versus the value of lived experience, it leaves us with a final thought for you to carry forward.
John Kane painted the industrial landscapes of Pittsburgh. These were places he knew intimately through years of back-breaking, dangerous work. His knowledge of those hillsides, rivers, and mills was derived from the physical act of moving earth, laying track, and handling steel.
So when an artist's canvas is shaped by their immediate lived experience and their manual work, is that work naive, or is it actually the ultimate unassailable form of expertise?
And what deep knowledge are we missing when we look at a work of art and fail to know the full story of the calloused hands that created it?